Okay, as we all know, the title of the conference is Regional Reactions to the Rise of Brazil, and one of the big parts of that is what's actually going on in the region on a regional level. So we're very lucky to have somebody who's deep expertise in Brazilian political economy and in the regional processes, I guess would be one way to put it, of Brazil and South America. Mahrukh Doctor from the University of Hull, who, on a sort of more personal level, is more or less who introduced me to Brazil in a sort of quick course a number of years ago. I won't say how many. And Mahrukh's
time to me, you mean?
Done to me. Mahrukh's paper is entitled Brazil's Rise and Its Neighbours, Balancing Global Ambitions and Regional Constraints. So I think with that, I will turn the floor over to Mahrukh.
Thank you. First, of course, I would like to very much thank ANU and especially the Center for Latin American Studies and Sean Burgess for inviting me here. It's been a real pleasure to be here in Australia, my first time, in fact, ever in Australia, and I've enjoyed every minute so far, so I hope to be back. Today I'm going to talk about Brazil's rise and its neighbors' reactions to it. The idea here being sort of, can one be a global power but not be recognized as the regional power that matters? Can one be, in other words, a regional leader without having relatively loyal regional followers? And in the last day or so, we've heard about all the reluctant following that was going on, if any following at all. Keeping these questions in mind, the first part of my talk will present two definitions and two contextual factors in Brazil's rise. And in the second part, I will discuss two specific recent events to show how Brazil's neighbors have reacted to or have perceived Brazil's rising power and influence. But first, a clarification. I mean, we sort of throw out words and concepts without thinking too carefully about them sometimes. What is Brazil's region? In fact, you can look at it in terms of four ever-widening concentric circles: Mercosur, South America, Latin America, and then the Western Hemisphere. And whether it's in a leader in one or the other can in fact vary, and whether it can be considered a regional power is another matter altogether too. In the post-Cold War and post-NAFTA specifically context, Brazilian foreign policy certainly seems to have honed in on the South American option, if you will, as its reasonable base. So let's start with some definitions. Although Shakespeare argued that a rose by any other name would be a rose, in international politics it's not like that. Labels do matter, and therefore conceptual clarity is very important. How do the two concepts, regional power and regional hegemon, differ? And can you be one and not be the other, in fact? And it is very important to understand this difference, to understand Brazil's rise and regional status and the prospects for it becoming a regional hegemon, if in fact it even wants to be the regional hegemon. So, what's a regional power? Basically a state that plays a leading role in the region. It possesses the necessary material, organizational, and ideational resources, as well as an ability to influence activities and outcomes in regional affairs. A regional power has certain key characteristics. It must be economically, politically, and culturally interconnected with its region. It should have influence over the construction and management of regional governance structures. It should provide collective goods, especially regional security. It should be seen, or is at least expected, to be seen to articulate regional interests in global forums, and, of course, must earn the recognition and respect of others, both inside and outside the region. Note that there can be more than one regional power in a region. This is very important. In South America, as this is the area I'll be focusing on, of course, Argentina and Venezuela are, let's say, the more vociferous. And not to underestimate others, such as perhaps Chile and Colombia, that are much quieter, but also certainly see themselves as regional powers. Intra-regional competition also is the norm in almost every region in the world. Look at Africa, the Nigerians and the South Africans maybe battle it out. In Asia, we have Japan, China and India, and so on and so forth. Okay, so it's nothing unusual that everybody is not immediately acknowledging Brazil as the regional power. And this brings me to the next definition, a regional hegemon. This is a state that through the deployment of a variety of mechanisms and power resources is acknowledged as regional leader within and outside the region, and it faces few, if any, meaningful challenges to its status as the regional power that matters. It must be able to ensure regional order, shape regional outcomes, create and dominate regional institutional arrangements, and earn the acceptance and recognition of other powers in the region. Now, hegemony may be exercised in different ways. So there's not only one way of being a hegemon, in other words, a forceful sort of brute, but you can have consensual, cooperative forms of hegemony where the focus is on a soft power, let's say, approach, and using strategies of inclusion where via sort of regional arrangements and institutions. So it's not that a hegemon must use hard power capabilities as a means of establishing its hegemony. In Brazil's case, of course, this is going to be very relevant. Moving on then from definitions to the context. Two contextual factors when looking at the environment in which Brazil's neighbors are reacting to Brazil's rise are very important to understand. First is the general context of the features of Brazilian foreign policy, and secondly is the more specific context of regional integration and cooperative initiatives, and of course, others' reactions to it. So, four main features, I'd say, stand out in Brazilian foreign policy and worth quickly reiterating, although they have been mentioned in Sean and Carlos and various other people's talks yesterday. Firstly, highly instrumental character of Brazil foreign policy actions, with the focus on national development objectives. As Marco Aurelio Garcia recently said in an interview, and I quote him, "Foreign policy should not be understood as a way of projecting Brazil's presence in the world, but rather as a substantial part of Brazil's national project." This is interesting. This pragmatic approach, of course, has fostered a culture of mediation, bridge building, but also avoiding commitments that reduce Brazil's own policy flexibility. This is very important for Brazil. The second feature, an emphatic realist approach, but with a twist. That is, with a focus on soft power capabilities, as well as a consistent defense of sovereignty, autonomy, and non-intervention in other states' domestic concerns. A third feature, commitment to multilateralism and universalism, also an interest for diversified relations. Brazil has always actively participated in all the international regimes and organizations, but more recently has become quite demanding in terms of reforming these systems, various global governance structures from IMF and World Bank boards to UN Security Council. Brazil, however, is a mildly revisionist power when compared to some of the others, like India. A fourth feature is the need to balance its multiple identities. Finally, in the Lula years, Brazilian foreign policy has added another element, and this is a strong ideological discourse. Much to the discomfort, I think, of many diplomats, sort of more technocratically oriented diplomats. This shift has been very neatly put, I think, by the Argentine academic Juan Tocatlian, who says Brazil's, Lula specifically's foreign policy shifted from a Westphalian to a Southphalian approach. Nice turn of words. The next contextual factor is, of course, Brazil's regional integration initiatives. Its main regional initiative in the 1990s was the formation of Mercosur in the spirit of open regionalism, market reform, adjustments to globalization, as was typical in the early 90s. Over the years, however, the economic integration aspect of Mercosur has become much less important than the political and social objectives of cooperation with its partners. Brazil also seems to have outgrown Mercosur in some ways, especially on the economic front. I should emphasize that. I think it would be fair to say at this point, Brazil uses Mercosur as a tool to manage its sometimes quite stressful relations with Argentina. I think for Brazil, that's the main reason it will not abandon Mercosur, is dealing with Argentina. And this is exactly why it has been uninterested in creating supranational structures and institutions, and has insisted on intergovernmental processes throughout. There is no other way Brazil will go forward on this. Gradually, of course, it has become more frustrated with dealing with Mercosur, to put it politely, and has now moved to a broader economic space. And since around the mid-2000s, so 2005, 2006, certainly from 2007, it has placed much more emphasis on the South American space and playing a role in the South American space, specifically, of course, being behind the setting up of UNASUR in 2008. UNASUR's 12 members have focused on political cooperation and dialogue with very low institutional demands, which suits Brazil very well, and a flexible approach to development policy and economic matters. The focus here is on cooperation rather than integration. Again, words, but they really do mean different things. Although Brazil is acknowledged as having designed and led UNASUR's initiative, South Americans have been willing to participate. Their participation, however, should not be seen as meaning they have a shared vision about the future development of the region. In fact, many of its members, other South American countries, have often disagreed with Brazil and even defied it. Many examples, I don't have time to go into them, people can ask if they like. Bolivia, dealings with Petrobras, Ecuador's dealings with Odebrecht, very well described yesterday, Paraguay's dealings with over the Itaipu issue, Argentina and many trade spats with it, and then the Pacific board countries and their views on a trade with China or Asia, more broadly speaking. So to summarize, in the past 2 decades, Brazil has led various regional initiatives, but its interest has shifted from economic integration to political cooperation, and security issues are also rising on the agenda. Also, Brazil indicates increasing interest in bearing some of the costs of regional leadership, which it hasn't before, but never at the price of its autonomy. And this is very important to emphasize. Hence, the strict adherence to intergovernmental structures and the very heavy reliance on presidential diplomacy. I think Guy, yesterday, I'm not sure where he's sitting, spoke very well about the Venezuelan-Brazilian relations on that issue. So, having set the context, how have South American countries responded to Brazil's rise? Undoubtedly, Brazil's South American neighbors have become increasingly interested in Brazil in economic terms, as with access to its market, investment from Brazilian firms, and what we've repeatedly heard, Brazilian contributions to regional infrastructure integration projects, usually through BNDES. However, Brazil does not really have the carrots nor the sticks to encourage acceptance of its regional, acceptance of it as regional hegemon. And I'm happy to take questions on that issue. My research has found that other South American nations are far from willing to accept Brazil as regional leader or regional hegemon. And again, all the talks yesterday repeatedly told you how anything but accepting, acknowledging Brazil as speaking for the region or being the region that mattered. It was interesting, in fact, that the Salvadoran minister spoke, and he had no problems with this. His talk had no problems with dealing with Brazil, but he's Central America. He's not in that sphere of influence that Brazil is now considering whether it should be the preeminent power, I won't say the dominant power, okay? There is an important difference. To help understand this, I thought it would be nice to shed light on two very recent events that throw light on how South Americans are responding to Brazil's growing global projection. The first is the formation of the Pacific Alliance, briefly mentioned yesterday, in fact. In May 2012, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile announced this new group with the intention to deepen economic cooperation so as to increase their competitiveness and to increase their trade and investment links with Asia. Now, should this alliance be seen as a rejection of the Brazilian and Mercosur model? Should it be seen as simply another new economic space to complement other Latin American integration projects, as in fact Peruvian President Humala has said it was? Or should it in fact be seen as a political club that is set up to counterbalance the Atlantic-facing Brazil? Whatever its future development, there are two clear messages that have been sent to Brazil with the formation of the Pacific Alliance. First, that not everybody was convinced about Brazil's development strategy, nor did they want to rely on it as the region's engine of growth. They'd rather look beyond the Americas. Secondly, the South American members were focused on its economic dimensions and remained willing to cooperate in flexible regional political and security arrangements supported by Brazil in organizations such as UNASUR. So the South American members have certainly emphasized that for them, the Pacific Alliance is an economic alliance and not a political and security-based one. This view, of course, cannot be applied to Mexico, the fourth member. Here, probably, we are seeing some sort of idea that the alliance is a club in which Brazil could be excluded, by the simple fact Brazil is not a Pacific-facing country. Okay? Labels, again, matter. The second event I looked at was actually a series of events. And this is the series of events related to the Paraguayan case, the impeachment of Lugo, the suspension of Paraguay from Mercosur and UNASUR, and Venezuela's entry as a full member of Mercosur. It is still very early days to know what the long-term implications of this is going to be. Certainly issues related to what are democratic integrity criteria really about? What is going to be the future formation and format of Mercosur? There are many questions that are still not answered. However, in the more immediate term, what has been the reaction in the rest, in South America? Clearly, everybody supported this position of suspending Paraguay. After all, both UNASUR and Mercosur have done it. But was this the right decision? And was this the decision that Brazil will come to regret, or in fact will consolidate its ability to deal with political crises in the region? So, although Brazil apparently prevailed in terms of refusing Argentina and Venezuela's demands for economic sanctions against Paraguay, because in the first instance, not only was suspension immediately agreed on, but these two countries also wanted economic sanctions. This, with especially the work of President Mahrukh of Uruguay and Antonio Patriota in Brazil, managed to avoid, which has, I think, been crucial. However, Dilma Rousseff's very initial, very hasty actions were clearly influenced by Cristina Fernandez Kirchner's urgings rather than legal aspects of the process. I think the fact that they were all in Rio for the opening of the Rio +20 summit meant they were all there, ready to immediately react and talk. So rather than having sort of cool heads prevail and looking at the legal aspects, they immediately spoke off the cuff, if you will. So this raises questions about how Brazilian foreign policy decisions are made, and it has sent a message to Brazil. And there have been messages for Brazil. First of all, can Brazil be seen from the point of view of the rest of South America as a trustworthy leader? Can it be expected to be a rule-adhering leader in the exercise of its leadership? Due process was ignored here. I know there are many interpretations, but care should have been taken with clarifying what interpretation is being used to go in, rather with the decision, to announce the decision, rather than to personalize in some way the reaction and certainly politicize the reaction. In fact, President Mujica even admitted as much. He said, sometimes the political must prevail over the juridical. He said this, okay? So it's not as if they're not aware that, inconvenient documents were ignored. Rules that they themselves had agreed on, I should add. The other thing is, should Brazil be concerned about being perceived as a bully, albeit with the support of all the other Mercosur and UNASUR members, okay? Is this perception going to be the lasting impression of this, 2, 3, 4 years later? Does it, on the other hand, mean something else? Has Brazil shown itself to be very easily, or to very easily bow to the views of the more vociferous presidents of South America? Is it easily swayed in its opinion, rather than sticking to upholding its national interest and making decisions based on institutionally driven processes? So to conclude, this I hope gives you food for thought, and I'll come back to the first two definitions. Does Brazil fit the definitions of regional power and regional hegemon? Well, if you remember what I said in the first 5 minutes, with respect to regional power, Brazil certainly fits all the criteria to some extent, and few, I think, would disagree that it is a regional power, as I described a regional power at the start. This does not mean it does not face challenges as well as challengers to its position, but in general, I think that is not so problematic a question. The more tricky question is, of course, can Brazil claim the label of regional hegemon? Brazil, in fact, cannot. And we could actually say it probably might not even want to claim that label. Brazil cannot meet the criteria in absolute terms for sure. It cannot ensure regional order on its own, nor can it convincingly dominate regional arrangements and outcomes. We saw all the defiance thrown at it whenever possible. However, regional conditions certainly do support the development of more cooperative forms of hegemony. The question is, will Brazil become more willing to take on the costs of leadership and convince others it would act as a benign hegemon. Without these two aspects, Brazil, in fact, has no chance of ever being recognized as regional hegemon. It probably, however, is fair to conclude that Brazil wants to be acknowledged as a regional power, and maybe even as primus inter pares in South America. But it does not need to establish itself as regional hegemon to achieve its foreign policy objectives and priorities and its global player ambitions. Thank you. With respect to the importance of the message being sent on the democratic questionability of the impeachment and the fact that due process was observed in terms of the letter of the law, but certainly not in terms of the spirit of the law. I absolutely agree. It was very important to send a message about in this region, in South America, we not only have a zone of peace, a nuclear-free region, but also a region where everybody is democratic governments, okay? However, this position was completely undermined by the follow-on decision to allow Venezuela to entry. Because here, again, not only was the letter of the rules not adhered to, but even perhaps the spirit. And that is the problem. So my criticism is not on the suspension of Paraguay because of the democracy, or exactly. My criticism is what they did subsequently, and not even subtly, the same day. At Mendonça, out they threw, they confirmed, in fact, throwing out Paraguay. All the UNASUR leaders also ran to Mendonça as an impromptu summit, also agreed with it. But then they all turned around and happily took Venezuela in, although the protocols, Mercosur protocols, clearly say all members must agree. We know, of course, the Paraguayan Senate has been holding out on this for the last 3-4 years. In fact, if you want, all the way back to 2006. This is what I criticize. And the not rule adhering criticism to Brazil is on the Venezuela issue and not on the democracy criteria issue. I hope that answers you. I think in a region with the sort of history it has had in terms of democracy and human rights issues and so on, nothing less actually should be acceptable. We must act in this region in terms of the spirit of democracy. The values of democracy must be upheld. And in this, Brazil, in fact, has been very good. And I have no criticism at all. Let's go to the other question, and that is it fair almost, I think you're asking, to expect one country to dominate across all issues? And is it even necessary for one country to be obviously the country you turn to show the model for everything on everything? No, I don't think so at all. However, traditionally, the international relations literature has placed a lot of emphasis on having clearly defined power hierarchies. You're a power, you may be a major power, middle power, minor power. You may, of course, have a hegemon too. And it is based on that sort of idea that people get so caught up in this. Of course, Brazil cannot lead on everything. In fact, Brazil itself doesn't necessarily even want to lead in every area. It knows in human rights, for example, especially on transitional justice, other countries have been at the forefront, Argentina being, in fact, one interesting example. However, having said that, when you're moving from being just a power towards a hegemon, if at all that hegemony is desired, and I don't think it is, then you need somebody who in some way has an site, if you will, of the process and should be expected to have some kind of position on most things. So a bit like a presidential system. The president ultimately is responsible for peace and security and development of the nation. However, of course, his various ministers and cabinet members may be, in fact, specialists in certain areas. So I don't think it removes that necessity when you become a hegemon. But certainly, Brazil feels it cannot, in fact, it's not even interested anymore in South America as an economic, let's say, basis of its power. What South America now is becoming is a politically important aspect, and for no other reason, perhaps, not no other reason, but perhaps one of the important reasons is the US itself has made clear, for you to be considered a regional leader, you must ensure security of your region. In other words, don't give us trouble. And Brazil, because of its soft power position, and even worse almost, its insistence on autonomy and non-intervention, has in some ways hindered it. And it's not by chance that Celso Amorim said when he was foreign minister, we've moved away from non-intervention in South and Latin America towards non-indifference. It was an important clarification. And taking up the leadership of the Haiti, UN Haiti operations was one sign to show Brazil is now also willing to move as a leader on the security issues, political issues, which in the past it never did so. Yes, in Latin America, as well as South America more specifically, integration efforts have been have been led at the highest political level, very often presidential level. And the original initiatives came at a time when the region was going through huge change, the market reforms of the early 90s, the change in terms of the democratic transition, and this meant most countries' civil societies, in some ways, were more preoccupied with these domestic challenges of democratization and market reform, and therefore not quite prepared to deal with, higher levels, interstate levels, which meant by default this adjustment to markets opening brought about the idea of regional integration, economic integration, as a step towards, in some way, increasing competitiveness globally. In other words, the germ, if you will, or the beginnings, the seeds of this process were very different than in Europe. In fact, Mercosur has tried to have a parliament, and there is one, but it is still not given much attention. Yes, occasionally issues may be raised there, but they do not feel they really have the sort of democratic credibility. Very often they even lack the support, if you will, of their societies, because most members of society, the ordinary person, in other words, the ordinary citizen, isn't even aware this exists. So it would be a pointless exercise in talking, and the South Americans have endless forums to talk in, but nothing is going to really go much further forward. The Mercosur did try to follow the European model of integration, move towards customs union, eventually a common market, but it has faced endless obstacles, some external shocks to their economies, but also internally driven processes. And given the huge sensitivity in the region to losing autonomy, meant you couldn't allow any kind of supranational institution to develop, effectively negating any chance of deepening integration in Mercosur and, of course, South America. Partly why Brazil is frustrated and decided, abandon the economic, let's go for the political, an area for political cooperation and dialogue. Let's start with China. The statist approach, is there some sort of interesting parallels? In fact, in the paper, I do mention, for the sake of the presentation, I focused on the statist approach, because just to make clarity and make some sort of coherence in the presentation. It's very important to understand, in the 90s, as I responded to the gentleman earlier, in fact, it was purely status. As time has moved on and Brazilian firms have started investing in many South American countries, trade relations, of course, have also increased. Some sort of production chains, although still not at the level that the Brazilians would ideally want, are developing. Societal actors are becoming more interested in regional integration issues on both sides, in Brazil and on the other side. I think Tim probably will talk today about how new actors have entered the scene in foreign policy that never before were there. In the old days, so to speak, in Brazil, foreign policy was the domain of the Itamaraty. Nobody else said anything about it. Today, starting with the PT itself and its many civil society organizations, but filtering right through society, as well as then business community, we are seeing many more important contributions they make in terms of lobbying activities, in terms of talking to the government to make the appropriate decisions. The BNDES, of course, is one of the crucial links between business and the government. This is how Brazil's projection, if you will, in the region has been most obvious. The political aspects, in fact, are quite low-key and very high level, if you wish. But for the ordinary citizen, many are having jobs because of Brazilian companies, something we talked about yesterday, in fact. So, very different approach from China, partly because Brazil is a democracy, partly because business is free to invest wherever it like. In fact, it is encouraged to do so. Moving on to the Paraguay-Venezuela. And one last question you had, Nicola, was, is there a political consensus? I think yes. Gradually in Brazilian society, we are seeing a growing consensus supporting the idea of Brazil moving to become a leader in South America, and certainly supporting Brazil's adventures in some way, sometimes abroad, whether in Africa or elsewhere, but also supporting the sort of, or giving value to Brazil's standing in the international community. I think it's finally becoming an important issue. Looking at the Paraguay-Venezuela question and that shift from economic integration to political, I should say that on the one hand, from Brazil's point of view, bringing Venezuela in had both economic and political reasons. Economic specifically because I think about a third of Venezuelan trade is in fact with Brazil, a large proportion of trade. Also, whatever little value-added trade Venezuela does have tends to be with Mercosur countries, South America more broadly sometimes. So in fact, for Brazil, it was interesting in economic terms to also somehow have, they think, more leverage on the way the Venezuelan government behaves. You know, trying to avoid a Bolivian situation where the Venezuelans suddenly go and nationalize maybe a Brazilian investment there. So there are economic calculations here. However, of course, there's also the political calculation. Looking more broadly, I think, in fact, Venezuela's entry was of great interest to Uruguay and Paraguay, notwithstanding Paraguay's refusal to let it in, as well as partly for Argentina, to create a little more balance in the region, hence a very political aspect. And then there is, of course, the security aspect. The Venezuelan-Brazilian border, not only a very long border, but in very sort of difficult to access conditions. For Brazil, it was important to have some kind of commitment or closer interaction to deal with the sort of non-traditional security threats that are rife on that border, narco-trafficking. I don't need to mention all the obvious problems along that border. So it's a mix for Brazil, interestingly, not just a political thing. The third question was Rosario's questions. One was about a renewal of the concept of what integration is. I agree. We've moved beyond, let's say, the neoliberal open regionalism type of concept towards some kind of post-liberal, post-Washington consensus approach. And because of that, we are still in the process, I think, in South America and Latin America more broadly, maybe even globally, of defining and redefining what in fact is a regional cooperation or integration about. And I think in South America, given the country's sensitivities towards non-intervention and maintaining policy flexibility and autonomy, most countries have moved away from the integration idea to the cooperation idea. And given this preference, I think, yes, I completely agree with you, that the Pacific Alliance should not be seen as excluding Brazil. At this moment, of course, it is a question of collaboration on the sort of issues where these four countries, and maybe in fact Panama and Costa Rica have also requested entry, can cooperate to come up with common rules for trade, rules of origin, trade facilitation issues, all that, ease their way, increase their competitiveness, not vis-a-vis each other, but with Asia, looking to Asia. And I think Brazil could eventually join that group, because Brazil, of course, also its largest trade partner nowadays is China. So it is becoming an interest for Brazil to become part of that. I think the more interesting distinction is between the Andean community and the Pacific Alliance. I think that's where we can see the real difference in approaches. What also the Pacific Alliance we need to see in terms of its difference with the Brazilian model or Mercosur model is that the countries of the Pacific Alliance have all had free trade agreements with the US, and all of them have some kind of agreements with Asian countries, free trade agreements, which of course Mercosur doesn't have. So here we are seeing a deepening, in a way, of their interest in Asia, a statement making that clear, and Mercosur is still trailing behind because they can't get their own development approach and their own trade policy act together. And because they've committed to negotiating together, well, where are they going to go? I think that was all the questions, right?
Thank you very much to Mahrukh.